Hey, what's up everybody? 8-Bit Flashback here. Today I'm going to review the RetroFlag GPi case. It's designed to work with Raspberry Pi Zero and the very popular retro gaming software, RetroPie. And this little Game Boy clone is capable of playing a bunch of different systems, such as Game Boy, Game Boy Advance, Nintendo, Super Nintendo, Sega Genesis, PC Engine, Arcade, Neo Geo, PlayStation, and much more. In this video, I'll be talking about some of the pros and cons with the RetroFlag GPi case, how to assemble the case, and I'm also going to be doing a bunch of emulation tests for various different systems. And for those of you out there that just want to see the emulation testing, that'll begin at the 9-minute mark of this video. The RetroFlag GPi case looks amazing. They did a fantastic job with the looks of the case. It looks just like a mini version of the Game Boy we all remember. Most of the buttons feel great as well, but the D-pad feels a little loose, and at times it seems inaccurate during gameplay, with games such as Pac-Man and Mortal Kombat. But with that being said, I would consider this issue minor, and for the most part, the D-pad seems to work just fine. Located on the left side of the case, you'll find the power input port, and also the adjustment for brightness. And here on the back of the case, you'll find the battery compartment that holds 3 AA batteries, and I average anywhere from about 3.5 to 4 hours of gameplay time. Inside here, you also see a micro USB port, and this will be used for future firmware upgrades. And just to let you know, I have tried connecting keyboards and USB flash drives to this micro USB port, and there seems to be no communication with RetroPie, so this seems to be unusable for RetroPie purposes. And this is something I really wish the GPi case had, is a usable USB port. And here's a look at the removable cartridge. And located inside this cartridge is where you install the Raspberry Pi Zero, which then connects to pogo pins that get converted to cartridge pinouts, that then connect to a cartridge port that's inside the GPi case, making this a removable cartridge, just like the original Game Boy, only it looks a little bit different. Located on the back of the case, you also find the left and right shoulder buttons, which look really cool and blend right in with the case design. But even though they look awesome, I find myself at times searching for the buttons, and I'd actually prefer if the buttons were a little bit concave, or if they even protruded a little bit from the case. That way you can find them easily while gaming. Located on the right side of the case, you'll find access for the micro SD card and your volume control. And on the very bottom of the case, you'll find the headphone jack. Inside the GPi case box, you will find a few extra items besides the case itself. There'll be a power cord that'll plug into that power port on the side with USB on the other end. You're also going to find a screwdriver that's double-sided with Phillips on one end and standard slotted on the other side. And you're also going to find all the necessary hardware to assemble your GPi case. Instructions are included as well, with nicely detailed pictures. In order to make the GPi case functional, you will have to install a save shutdown script to a fresh RetroPie image to make the power button functional, and then install a case patch that makes your HDMI communication work through the GPIO pins. And this is fairly easy to do, but if you want to make this even easier and be able to play PlayStation 1 games, I recommend using the pre-made RetroPie image made by the Super RetroPie team that already includes everything needed to make your GPi case functional. And on top of that, they've included a standalone PlayStation emulator that does a pretty good job for PlayStation emulation on the Raspberry Pi Zero. And they have done a bunch of other awesome stuff as well with this image that makes life easier. And I'll be sure to post a link to their Facebook page down below where you can find this image. And just for a size reference, here it is next to the original Game Boy, and as you can see, it's just a little bit smaller, with a lot of the ports being in the same exact locations, making it look very, very similar. And here's something I found interesting. The artwork on Wario Land for Game Boy is actually very similar to the artwork on the RetroFlag cartridge. So as you can see here, the cartridge shapes are a little bit different for the GPi case versus the original Game Boy, but when they're both inside the cases, they do look very similar. Now it's time to assemble the case, and I'd recommend using the Raspberry Pi Zero W because it has internet capabilities, which makes it much easier to add games and various files after it's installed inside the GPi case. When using a regular Raspberry Pi Zero, I'd recommend configuring it as much as possible before installing it inside the GPi case, because there'll be no way to add games due to it not having any USB ports. And keep in mind, if you're trying to use the pre-made Super RetroPie image, HDMI will be disabled by default until you uninstall the case patch that's located on the root of the microSD card, which can be uninstalled and installed easily once you know how it works. Now it's time to grab the GPi case cartridge, and it should just be snapped together. So we're just going to gently pull the two halves apart, and it should unsnap. And inside here is where you're going to find the I/O conversion board that contains that pogo pin connection. Now let's go ahead and grab that small micro USB adapter, and that's going to plug into your USB port located on the Pi Zero right here. Once you have that adapter plugged in, it's time to grab the front half of the case that contains the Raspberry Pi Zero mounts. Now I'm going to place my Raspberry Pi Zero inside this half of the case and line it up with the 4 different mounts. And you might have some issues trying to get it to line up correctly because of the micro SD card cover, but this can be easily removed so you can get that board in place, and then you can put that cover right back on. Now it's time to secure the Raspberry Pi Zero to this half of the case, and I'll be using these 4 brass screws, and one will be going in each corner. And because these are so small, it might be easiest just to use your hands to get them started, and once you barely get them started, you can go ahead and use your screwdriver to tighten them the rest of the way. But make sure not to over tighten these because you could break your board if you over tighten them. Now it's time to grab that conversion board that contains the pogo pin connections. And on one side of this board you're going to find the pogo pin connection, and on the opposite side is going to be the USB connection. And here's a look at the pogo pins, which are all spring-loaded to provide a solderless connection to the GPIO pinout on the Raspberry Pi Zero. And it's very easy to install this board. It just lines up with those 4 brass screws that secure the Raspberry Pi Zero. Once you have this board in place, it's time to connect the USB cable, which connects right here. To connect it, just push up on this black container clip, then slide the USB cable into the white USB port, then push the black container clip back down to secure it. Now go ahead and grab the back half of the cartridge case. And you'll see located right here, there's a tab that lines up with the hole that's right here on the board. So now you want to go ahead and carefully line up the back half of the cartridge case, and go ahead and snap that back together with the front half. Then you'll want to use these 4 smaller silver screws to secure the 2 halves together, with one going in each corner, and be careful not to over tighten these screws as well. And the assembly is now done. Now it's time to pop in my micro SD card, which already has the Super RetroPie image pre-installed with full support for my RetroFlag GPi case. Also, something else I would like to mention is the safe shutdown switch, which is located inside the battery compartment. You'll want to make sure this is in the on position, otherwise the safe shutdown will not work. Now it's time to power up my case and wait for RetroPie to boot up. For those of you familiar with RetroPie, you already understand how long it takes to boot it up. But for those of you new to the scene, it might be a surprise how long it takes. With my current setup, it usually takes about 45 seconds to boot to the main menu. But for me, this is not a big deal, especially for what RetroPie has to offer. I also have a custom splash screen I'm using that I believe was compiled together by Kev Rose, and he did an awesome job with this. And this gives my GPi case some nice boot animation to look at while I'm waiting for it to load. And I'll make sure to post a link for this down below. The screen has great viewing angles due to it being an IPS LCD. It measures at 2.8 inches with 320 by 240 pixel resolution. The sound is pretty good as well. When turned all the way up, there doesn't seem to be much distortion at all. Now I'm going to power off the GPi case and demonstrate the safe shutdown, which usually takes around 7 seconds. And it's off. And now we're powered back up. So I have a bunch of systems I've already added games and BIOSes for. And what you're looking at here is a custom theme for Emulation Station called Super Retro Boy, which is included with the Super RetroPie image. And now it's time to test some gaming emulation out, and what better system to start with than Game Boy. And as you can see here, it can handle Game Boy emulation no problem. And for the most part, all your 8-bit and 16-bit systems will play just fine on the Raspberry Pi Zero. Anything after that though is kind of hit or miss. Now let's test out some Game Boy Advance. This is Rayman. Now emulation for Game Boy Advance is pretty decent, but it does have trouble with some games, so it's not perfect emulation, but I'd say overall it's pretty playable. Now let's test out some arcade games using MAME for All. This is Miss Pac-Man, and this game plays really well. But arcade emulation on the Raspberry Pi Zero is pretty hit or miss. A lot of games from the 90s and on will not work, but a lot of the games from the 1980s will work just fine. Now let's test out the Sega Master System. This is Afterburner, and the emulation for the Sega Master System seems to be doing really well. And while you're watching the gameplay footage here, it might seem a bit choppy, but this is how it played on the original Sega Master System. This port of Afterburner for the Sega Master System, unfortunately, is not very good. And here's Sega Genesis with Virtua Racing, and the gameplay for this game seems to be pretty good. Most of the Sega Genesis emulation on the Raspberry Pi Zero is pretty good. There is a few games out there that don't seem to work that great, but for the most part, I would say it's pretty solid emulation on the Raspberry Pi Zero. And here is PC Engine, and we'll test Afterburner 2 out. Now this version of Afterburner, I know this is the second one, but this version plays much better on the PC Engine. The gameplay is nice and smooth, it doesn't feel choppy at all, and the controls feel great as well. As far as the PC Engine emulation goes, it seems to be doing really well. Next up is Super Nintendo. This is Ultimate Mortal Kombat 3. The emulation for Super Nintendo on the Pi Zero, I would say, is fair. There is quite a few games that seem to work just fine, but there's definitely a handful of games out there that don't seem to play well at all. Now this might be due to the emulator being tied in with RetroArch. One thing that could be done is you could install a standalone emulator for Super Nintendo, and you'd probably have much better results. And here's an example of a standalone emulator called Pi FBA for Neo Geo. There's actually a couple different emulators you can use for Neo Geo games. The first one I tried was a version that uses RetroArch, and the gameplay for Neo Geo games was terrible. But when using this standalone emulator, the emulation for Neo Geo is much better, and I'd say the games are very playable. And last on the list is PlayStation, which also uses a standalone emulator called the PCSX Rearmed. It's been configured to work with the Raspberry Pi Zero by the Super RetroPie team. The emulation is definitely not perfect, and you will find some games don't play that well. But I would say the majority of the PlayStation games are in a very playable state with decent emulation. And if you look in the bottom left corner, you can see the frames per second count, which has frame skip enabled. Even though the emulation isn't great, it's still very impressive that it works this good on the Raspberry Pi Zero. And the emulation is a good enough experience for me that I can still enjoy playing. Now there is a couple of issues I have run into when trying to use this emulator on my GPI case. One of those being is when I exit the emulator and I try to start another game, a lot of times it freezes up on me. And the only ways I found around this is either to just reboot the console before I start another game, or to start another emulator such as the Neo Geo standalone emulator Pi FBA. So instead of rebooting the console, I just start a Neo Geo game, then exit that game, then go back and pick a PlayStation game, and everything seems to work fine. Now I have heard of other people having this same issue as me, and I've heard of other people not having this issue at all. And I'm sure this is something that can be resolved easily with just a little update here in the near future. The Super RetroPie team has done a great job with all the controls. The D-pad is now functional with most all the games, and you also have the R2 and L2 support by holding the Y button while pushing the left shoulder button or the right shoulder button at the same time. And you can exit a game by pushing Start and Select at the same time. To access the emulator menu, you can push Select and X at the same time. That'll bring you to the menu options. To back out of a menu, push Select and B, and that'll take you back to the previous menu option. So Spider-Man seems to be playing pretty good. Now let's try out some Skull Monkeys. And this game is also playing well, but I have noticed some graphical issues. Objects on the screen at times will just disappear then reappear with no rhyme or reason. But the game for the most part I'd say is playable. And here's Mike Tyson's Boxing. And I was very excited to play this game because I'd never played it before. I did play Mike Tyson's Punch-Out back in the day. But this game is kind of a letdown. It's not that fun to play, and it doesn't look that great either. So here's my overall thoughts with the RetroFlag GPi case. It's very affordable and is capable of emulating a bunch of different systems. The IPS screen looks great, although at times, certain smaller text can be hard to read due to the resolution. The case itself is beautiful and very easy to assemble. My complaints with the D-pad and shoulder buttons I would consider to be just a minor issue. The lack of a usable USB port is kind of a bummer, and it makes it a pain for certain things that I'm used to. And it'd also be nice if it had a rechargeable battery. And I did notice that when my GPi case is powered on, it seems to produce a light humming noise. But this is not noticeable when I'm playing games because that noise is so quiet. Now for all the cons that I've been mentioning, these are all just minor issues, and I'm just bringing them up just because this is stuff that I would prefer, but they're not that big a deal. And for the most part, the RetroFlag GPi case, I think, is an amazing product. And if you're looking to relive your childhood memories by playing the retro games you used to play as a kid, then the RetroFlag GPi case might be for you. Okay, it is time for me to get out of here, and if you like this video, if you could hit that like button, and have yourself a great day, and I'll see you next time.